We are in Daniel, the 9th chapter, and really throughout much of Daniel, right up till we got to the 9th chapter here, we moved pretty rapidly through this book. And then we got to chapter 24, and the end of chapter 9 really has slowed us down, but that's okay. Because 9 and 10 really are setting the stage for these last two chapters of the book of Daniel. And really are some really neat chapters and have some great things in them. So last week, in these verses, 24 through the end of the chapter, we focused in on those 70 weeks, and in particular, the 6 things that were going to be accomplished by the end of the 70 weeks. This morning, we are going to reread these verses, and I have just a comment or two about the abomination of desolation, and then once all of our questions and comments are dealt with, we'll move on to chapter 10. So that is the outline or the agenda for this morning. Let's go ahead, before we get into any of this, reread these verses. And you'll recall in the beginning of chapter 9, who's praying? Someone's praying for most of the chapter 9. Gabriel, close. That's answer to question number 2. So, hold on to that thought for a second. So, who's praying? Or did you say? You said Daniel. I misheard you. You are correct, Andy. I was maybe thinking too much about question number 2. Daniel is praying, and it's a prayer of confession, right? He understands, according to the prophecy of Jeremiah, that the time of captivity is almost over, and he's looking forward to going back to Jerusalem. All this is true, but God gives him a much bigger picture and says, Daniel, there's a lot more here to all this, and that has an impact on Daniel. So Daniel's praying, and who comes to talk to Daniel while he's praying? Gabriel. That's what I heard, Andy, when you said Daniel, but Gabriel comes to him while he's praying. Friday morning, Amanda, John Kerr, and I had breakfast, and while I was praying, our waitress came to us. But that's about as exciting as physically took place during that prayer. But can you imagine Gabriel comes to Daniel while he's praying, and he starts to give him a lot of information. So that's what the context for this is. Questions or comments on that? So this is Gabriel explaining to Daniel what's going to take place. Starting in verse 24 of Daniel chapter 9. 70 weeks are decreed about your people in your holy city to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint the holy place. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of the anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again in squares and moat, but in troubled time. And the 62 weeks an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people, the prince who is to come, shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war, desolations, as are decreed. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, And for half a week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. All right, so Gabriel comes, and can you imagine, this is the clarification. He says, this is what's going to take place. And I mentioned last week, it's hard for us to understand some of the details, or to, with all certainty, to say, here's what the details are. But what we do know is this. Chapter 11 and 12 talk about the coming history with such accuracy. Does anyone know what the number one criticism of the latter part of Daniel is? Okay, kind of understand. Yeah, that can be a criticism. What about a deeper critique or criticism from people who do not believe in its inspiration? Does anyone have any idea what the critique might be? Might it be that the information's inaccurate? That's not it. In fact, the critique is that it's so accurate that it must not have been written in the time of Daniel. It was written hundreds of years later. What's the evidence for that? Simply its accuracy on what it predicts to follow. So my point in that being, it's important for us to step back and to remember a couple of things. Number one, last week I mentioned this. It's okay for us to disagree on the details of what these 70 weeks mean in the following prophecy. But number two, it's important for us to understand the message that is being conveyed. And that message is clear. Daniel, your city is going to be rebuilt. But it's going to be a troubled time. And there's this great desolation that's going to follow it. Right? That message is crystal clear to even us today. But Daniel, your city is going to be rebuilt. Now, we looked at the 6 things that were going to be accomplished by the end of those 70 weeks. And what was the fixating point that I, in my presentation, anchored all these things around? Wasn't really my concept, or it's just what I presented. To finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness. What event, or here's a big clue, if you're having trouble remembering, person do all these things circulate around? Jesus. Right? They all have to do with Jesus. And in my mind, clearly, the first advent of Christ. All these things are going to be taking place. Now, to illustrate that, and we could look at several dates, and as I'm studying 11 and 12, one of the challenges I'm having for you folks is to not get too deep into the history and take an overview, and so we don't get bogged down. But here's something I think is really, really interesting. The return of Ezra to Jerusalem. We're going to be considering the book of Ezra in a few moments as we get into chapter 10 anyhow. Takes place in 457 BC. So Ezra returns to Jerusalem from the Babylonian captivity in 457 BC. Now, David already explained to us that he likes doing math. So, David, if you take 457 BC and you add to it 490 years that we've been considering, where does that leave us? I'll help you out. 33 AD. I don't know, does that year sound like it might be significant? Pretty cool, isn't it? Pretty cool. Really neat. So, like I said, we kind of didn't get to read all the quotes, but even Jesus seemed to be anchoring Daniel's prophecy into his time, at least in two places. In chapter 24, as he's predicting the destruction of Jerusalem, he says to the people he's talking to, when you see the abomination of desolation that Daniel speaks of, run, flee, right? That sure seems to me like Jesus is anchoring it in his time. Also in chapter 26, he's standing on trial before the high priest. And what makes the high priest rip his garments and yell blasphemy and was kind of the end of the trial? Jesus quotes Daniel. Says, henceforth you'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds, in the right hand of God. That we looked a couple weeks ago at how that's a quote from Daniel. What's Jesus saying? He's saying, I am the one prophesied by Daniel, right? All those things put together, I think, are really an interesting and encouraging time frame. Questions or comments on that? So as we read 26 and following, 26 reads about the anointed one shall be cut off. What happens to the anointed one? He's crucified, right? He's cut off, but that doesn't last forever. And then he goes on, the people and prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end shall be war. Desolations are decreed. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half a week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offerings. On the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Now, we could get into, as I mentioned before, all the details of these. Allow me to quote a couple of people that I think sum up what is taking place here. Josephus dedicates numerous pages of his books telling about the time of right before 70 AD when Jerusalem is in riots, there's different factions warring against each other. You see, we oftentimes talk about the destruction of Jerusalem from Rome in 70 AD, but what's taking place inwardly is it's in utter chaos and decay, right? They're fighting. In fact, the siege of Jerusalem, if I'm not mistaken, lasts right around 3.5 years, and the people were starving. Well, they had enough storage of food that they should have lasted at least a decade. Does anyone know why they didn't and they were starving? Because internal factions burned the storage, the food storage. Burned it up, fighting amongst each other. Now, we talked a couple weeks ago, and Josephus tells about one group of robbers who killed so many people, thousands and thousands of people, and do you remember what they had done with the dead bodies? Where'd they stack them? In the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies. I can't remember if I believe it was Keel, the commentator, says it this way. The Jews had made Jerusalem morally desolate, and the Romans came about and finished making it physically desolate. So they had destroyed it from within before before it was destroyed from outside. In fact, Josephus tells us that the destruction that took place was a sure and certain sign that Jehovah had forsaken the city. Now, having said that, I think these are signs that the people of the time would have seen that Jesus in Matthew 24 is telling them to look for. But what was the ultimate sin of the Holy of Holies that took place prior to that? What was the worst sin that ever took place? Crucifixion. I'm sorry?
The crucifixion.
The crucifixion. What's that have to do with the Holy of Holies? The Holies of Holies represent the presence of God, the dwelling place of God. Jesus said to the Jews, build or tear down this temple. They're looking at the physical temple, and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. What's the connection there? They didn't catch it. They said, 47 years we've been building. And you can rebuild it in 3 days?
Building. When he was crucified, the drapes were rent from the top to the bottom, doing away with the Holy of Holies. But he was still in the world for how many days after he was crucified. But they were looking for a physical place, and they couldn't believe that's, when he said he built in 3 days, they didn't understand that at all.
Absolutely. So allow me to fixate on a little bit of what you said, Bob, to make this very clear. Christ is connecting the two. He's saying the physical representation of the presence of God is in me. I'm his anointed one. I am the presence of God. That's the temple they destroyed. That's the ultimate abomination that brings about desolation, that brings about destruction. So the ultimate abomination of desolation, I think, is the crucifixion of Christ. Then the city at that point, what did they say during Jesus' trial? Let his blood be upon us and our children, right? They were taking onto themselves the responsibility. There are signs that Jesus is talking about, Matthew 24, that follow, that ultimately brought about the destruction. Just be clear. Judaism today cannot exist as it did in the Old Testament. Cannot, under any circumstances. Why? Because of the events that took place in 70 AD. It was destroyed in such a way that it had never been destroyed before and cannot be redone. There's a lot of talk today about breeding the right cows, right heifer, sacrifice. The problem with that is we don't even know who a Levite is, right? We'd have to recreate the Israelite people. They don't exist any longer. That was part of what was destroyed in 70 AD. The destruction was complete. It was horrible. And I think it's exactly what Jesus was prophesying about when he says, when you see these signs, flee, don't come back. Josephus tells us that when Rome is sieged, I believe it was Vespasian, that stops the siege. History can't explain why. All the Jews stayed in the city. In fact, they're fleeing to the city because they believed it was impenetrable. So they're fleeing too. All the Christians, Josephus tells us, flee out. Why? They understood the prophecies. They understood the end was there. Questions or comments? That's a very very superficial scratch of the surface, so to speak. And so I've put some ideas out. There's lots to dig into there if you would like to study and look at that further. All right, so with that, I think then chapter 10 gets into some things that are a little easier to understand, but quite possibly more amazing. How many, well, how do I want to ask this? How many of you think about the angelic world around us on a regular basis? Say not too much, right, for most of us. In fact, I think that maybe in our fellowship, typically we've really suppressed the idea of spiritual warfare in some of the supernatural things that are taking place around us. But what we see is a glimpse in chapter 10 into the supernatural, into the angelic world. Now, Kaufman states that this is the only place that we see that glimpse. I think there's a couple others where we see that all kinds of things are taking place. So let me put it this way. Today we see world conflicts taking place, right? The obvious one, I think, is Ukraine and Russia are fighting one another. We see that from the physical standpoint, don't we? We see two nations and groups of men and leaders clashing and physical conflict taking place. We don't often think about the fact that there's angelic battles behind those taking place. And the significance of that is, if there's angelic battles taking place, in other words, now simplify this for a moment, there's an angel or some kind of angelic being or group with Russia, there's also a group with Ukraine. If all that's true, wouldn't it seem to reason that I have angelic help? You say, well, the Bible doesn't say anything. The Bible says a lot about this. In fact, many places in the Bible, and this is just an allusion to it, but the Hebrew writer in one would say, well, Paul more specifically says that the unseen is that which lasts. The unseen's the real world. Sometimes we think of reality as being our physical. It's the opposite. Sometimes how many of you don't raise your hand to this, but think about it. How many of you would describe yourself as a human with a spirit? You're the opposite. You're a spirit with a body. You see the significance of that? The real is the unseen. The physical's the temporal, that which doesn't last. That's the difference. You're not a body with a spirit. You're a spirit who has a body currently. Just to perk the interest a little bit, if you would turn your Bibles to Matthew 18. Sharon, I'm standing to the side a lot, so if we have comments, if you would direct, we don't currently, but. Uh-oh. Well, I said 18, but now I've confused things in my head. It's a scary place to be. All right, I'll come back to that a little bit later. So I was teasing you with it anyhow, and now I'm not teasing you. Well, I'm teaching you in a very different way, Mike. That's all intentional. All right, so maybe read it and then I'll know.
Angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven.
Thank you, Stephanie. If you'd have said that like 3 minutes ago, I wouldn't look so foolish.
Well, then I wouldn't look so good.
True enough. Good point. So Matthew 18, verse 10. I've been bailed out here. See, and of course, this chapter starts with who's the greatest and children being like children. Verse 10, see that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who's in heaven. What do they have? Angels, right? What's the common term today that's used? Guardian angels. I think maybe that makes some assumptions, right? But the point is that there's angelic beings watching over people and groups of people. We're going to see a glimpse into that in chapter 10. Just this glimpse. And here's the cautionary note I say to that. I say to all this. It's necessary we recognize it, that we know it's there, that we know God is at work in ways we can't see. To me, and I think one of the reasons people get so uncomfortable talking about these things is the mistake that's oftentimes made is thinking because we know it's there that we understand it and know what's going on. We start making all these extrapolations about what they are and are not doing. That to me, I think, is a very important cautionary note. So that's not my desire. It's not my intent. I think it's beyond me to explain what exactly they do and don't do. It's just my point to point out that they're there. And God's working in ways we can't even fathom, can't even see, begin to see. All right, back to Daniel 10. Unless there's questions on those preliminary ideas. Probably lots of questions not anyone wants to ask. All right, chapter 10, verse 1. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a word was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belshazzar. And the word was true, and it was a great conflict. And he understood the word and understanding of the vision. Verse 2. In those days, I, Daniel, was mourning for 3 weeks. I ate no delicacies, no meat or wine entered my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all for full 3 weeks. On the 24th day of the 1st month, as I was standing on the bank of the great river, that is the Tigris, I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a man clothed in linen with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like beryl. His face was like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and the sound of his words were like the sound of a multitude. Plenty to deal with there, plenty. So, Daniel is talking about mourning and fasting. And there's lots of speculations about what exactly that means, but this is what I think this means from the context. Daniel is mourning, hence he's fasting. You ever been so upset you didn't have an appetite? That's what's going on. Daniel is fasting because he's mourning. In fact, we read in verse 1 that this is over a great conflict. There's some clues here that are not expressly stated. Why is Daniel mourning? This is really important point. Why is Daniel mourning? Well, we're not told here in Daniel, but yet we're kind of told. This is the 3rd year of Cyrus. If we were to go back, and I encourage you to do so, we're not going to do it in our class today, but if you read the book of Ezra, the first chapter of Ezra tells about Cyrus being compelled by God to rebuild Jerusalem in the temple. And so he sends a decree to do so. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2, we're told all the people, right around 50,000 people, can you think about that? All the people are taken into Babylon. Only 50,000 come back. The rest of them, it would seem, grown accustomed to their new culture, their new way of living. But anyhow, they come back and they start to rebuild. But by Ezra chapter 4, if I'm not mistaken, opposition builds and the rebuilding stops. It's halted. Guess when that was? 3rd year of Cyrus. It would seem strongly alluded, while not openly stated, that Daniel is mourning. He's so sick he's not even eating much for a course of 3 weeks. And the time frame would put it the same of which the rebuilding of Jerusalem stops. Questions or comments? So, while he's in this state, he's at the river of Tigris, which Babylon was on Euphrates, so some, bring issue with that. But remember, Daniel is working for the king, right? He's in company of many other people, so it would seem perfectly reasonable that he's traveling and that he's on the bank of the Tigris. He's just telling you where he is. It's not that it seems that that's overly relevant for the vision. But this vision takes place, and in fact, we stopped in verse 6, but in verse 7 we see everyone around him. Daniel starts to tremble and he falls down. What's everyone do? You learn something about your friends in situations like this. So, Mike, if you and I are on a hike together and I fall down and start convulsing, what are you going to do?
Where am I going?
What are you going to do?
I'm going to try to get you help.
You're going to try to get me help. See, I want to go on a hike with Mike. The rest of these guys just ran off. Daniel didn't have friends. They run off. They scatter. They don't strive to help Daniel. But what's taking place is this vision so overwhelming that Daniel falls down. Now, throughout the rest of the chapter, we're going to see angels or man figures touching Daniel 3 times. And each time he's partially restored until finally he's on his feet and able to speak again. Now, there's this figure. Verse 5 says, I lifted up my eyes, and behold, a man clothed in linen with a belt of fine gold and uphaz around his waist. There's this incredible image pointed out here. Many think it's Gabriel because Gabriel is the angel in the prior chapter. I believe it's representative of Christ. I don't think it has a big impact either way, but when you look at the description of Jesus in Revelation, there is very close resemblance between the two. So that's just my idea on it. He looks up, and it's interesting. His words were like a multitude, right? It sounded like a whole crowd speaking in unison when he speaks. Questions or comments on that? A couple more verses here, starting in verse 7. And I, Daniel, alone saw the vision. For the men who were with me did not see the vision, but a great trembling fell upon them. Here, Mike's what you said you wouldn't do for me. And they ran and hid themselves. Yeah, good buddies. I think they were work associates, not friends. Verse 8, so I was left alone and saw the great vision. My strength was left in me. My radiant appearance was fearfully changed, and I retained no strength. Then I heard the sound of the words, and as I heard the sound of his words, I fell on my face in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. So he's unconscious, right? We'd say he fainted, something along those lines. And behold, a hand touched me and set me trembling to my hands and knees. So now here's the first touch. He's brought to his hands and knees. And he said to me, O Daniel, man greatly loved, understand the words that I speak to you, and stand upright, for now I have been sent to you. And when he had spoken this word to me, I stood up trembling. We'll pick up there next week.